Welcome to In the Arena of Success. This podcast is where courage meets opportunity. I'm your host, Henry Beeman, and every week we step into the arena with visionaries, innovators, and trailblazers from all walks of life. We dive deep into the heart of success and uncover the strategies, the struggles, and the unwavering spirit of those who overcome. The real question is, are you willing to step into the arena and fight for your success? Because in this arena, success is not a destination. It's a journey, and it starts right now. All right, I am joined today by Major General retired John Ferrari. He is a non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He spent over 32 years in the United States Army and was the commanding general of White Sands Missile Range, a deputy commander for programs at NATO, commanded in and out of combat zones, and has led programs analysis and evaluation for the entire Army. And I'm super excited to have this conversation with you today, sir, and thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me.
So we start this off with the same 6 questions for everybody. And the first question is, what is your hometown and what is it known for?
Yeah, so I'm from Long Island, New York, and it's kind of known for being the bedroom suburb of New York City.
Okay, that's a neat place. Do you prefer cats or dogs?
So have neither, but the kids dog sit a lot, so I guess we're an unofficial dog family.
An adopted dog family. What kind of music do you listen to?
Yeah, so I think it's I'd say traditionally it's been country music and 80s rock. Although what I will say now is with Apple Music, after a while you dial in, it's got your own radio station and it serves you up all sorts of interesting things. So I think it's evolving over time.
That's pretty interesting. I don't think I would have guessed country music from a Long Islander.
So the kids, as they were growing up, we've lived in Virginia for a long time, and then really when we were stationed in New Mexico, they really got a heavy dose of it and kind of have adopted it, and so that became kind of the family music.
That's neat. What is currently on your reading list?
So I'm reading 3 books right now. One is Smart Brevity, and it's really about how do you change your communication style in the digital age. Kind of the premise is that we've all been trained to write on paper, but very few people consume things on paper anymore. So how do you change for people who are attuned to the digital age? The second is a book called Generations, which talks about, this is one of the first times in recorded history we have 5 or 6 generations living on the earth at the same time. And there's a big difference between the generations, and understanding especially those who are, maybe 0 to 22 years old, and how different they are than other generations. So I'm working through that. And then the third book is a book called Recoding America. And it's why is it that good-meaning, well-intentioned people who work in the government design computer code and systems to serve the people they want to serve, but actually wind up not serving them. So it's kind of a primer through examples on why government software is so bad.
Oh,
but
wow.
All 3 of them have something in common, right? Which is, right, how are people adapting in the new world and changing, right? How is communication adapting? And how come large bureaucracies like government aren't adapting to this new digital computer age?
That's a challenging problem set to look at, is adapting, especially post-pandemic. The world has shifted very quickly, and a lot of folks are playing catch up.
Yeah, that's true. In some ways, the pandemic just accelerated or, let people actually observe the changes that were ongoing. So maybe it took, 10 years off that learning curve. But the digital changes are here. ChatGPT and AI are just going to continue that acceleration. But it's very difficult when organizations, people, and bureaucracies are built really still for, in many respects, the mainframe age, in some respects, but then even the
Right.
personal computer age of the 90s. So our cultures and processes and thought processes are linked to the 50s, 60s, and then the 90s, and really haven't transitioned into the 2020s yet.
Wow. Shifting gears just a little bit, who is your biggest inspiration in life?
So I think what I would say, and it would be my parents, right? Because they taught me several important lessons in life early on. One is to work harder than everybody else, to take care of the resources you've been entrusted with, and focus on your family, right? And those three principles have really kind of guided everything I've done since then.
And you may have answered the last of the lightning round questions with that one, but what is the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Yeah, so I'd say those three, right? Always work harder than everybody else, right? Because it's very difficult to be the most talented person at something. And my career is really studied with not being actually the most talented person. Actually, my career in the Army has been remarkably unremarkable, right? But if you go in and you work harder and longer than everybody else, and then you guard those resources you've been given, whether it's soldiers or time or monetary resources, those two together will really help you out. And then always remember that even within your organizations, like people, I used to remind people when I worked in the Pentagon that we used to build this thing called a POM, which is really a Pentagon acronym for the 5-year resourcing plan. And I have to remind everybody that the POM, that plan that we all put so much time in, day and night, wasn't going to show up at their funeral, right? And that they needed to make sure they kept perspective on what was important in life.
Absolutely. And kind of leading from that, you talk about making it into the Pentagon and a career that's remarkably unremarkable. Where does your story start in your mind?
So I think it starts, in the Cold War. Right? In some ways, it's shaped by history. In some ways, it's shaped accidentally. So I came out of West Point in 1987. And back then, right, the Cold War was raging. The Reagan buildup really was going on. And the really hot place to be was armored cavalry regiments in Germany, right? Tanks in the front line, the East-West German border. And in my class, some of the most remarkable leaders, like great, unbelievably talented, naturally born leaders, went armor. And so did I. But at that point, armor was a growing career field. It was large. So I kind of figured there was enough room in it. And what the cavalry kind of taught me, I did the 2nd Cavalry, and then I did Desert Storm, and then 3rd Cavalry was kind of take the initiative, right? The world is an ambiguous place. Go out there, figure out what's going on, and do something. But by the time I came out of the 3rd ACR, the Cold War was over, Desert Storm was over. The Army had, the end of history was upon us, and the Army was in perpetual drawdown. And so I knew fairly quickly I needed to pivot until the Army kind of sorted this stuff out. So I wanted to go to graduate school, and that was at that point I decided either the Army was going to send me to graduate school or I was going to leave the Army, right? And so, I never intended to stay in forever. So that was at that point, and I got picked up, late in the process to be an economics instructor at West Point. So if that had not happened, I was all set and ready. We were about to go on deployment to Kuwait for 3 or 4 months. As soon as I came back, I was going to resign and go to grad school because I already had my grad school picked out. So that was a pivotal decision because I wound up in the economics department at West Point, and I was able to also work at an office called the Office of Economic and Manpower Analysis, which kind of helped. It's a little think tank of ORSA work, operations research, that really discovered data analytics before data analytics was cool. This was when if you said you were a data scientist, they put you in the basement and nobody invited you to parties because you were boring. Now today, data scientists they're like rocking and rock stars, right? So back then, yeah, not so cool. But what that enabled me to do was to see the business side of the Army and understand a little bit about how the Pentagon works, personnel policy, relations with Congress, acquisition processes. And so when it came time to kind of leave West Point and go back to the field, that was right at the time that the Army was bringing in the Stryker vehicles. and it was converting over Army units. And essentially, the Chief of Staff of the Army told the Armor Corps, you need to convert over. And the Armor Corps essentially said, well, over our dead bodies. And he said, okay. And there went all the armor units, right? A large chunk of them. So I could read the room fairly quickly and figured out like there were all these other amazingly talented leaders. And so what was I going to do just to, I'd been in the Army for 10, 11 years, and like the prospect of trying to make it to 20, like I was really worried. It was like, oh, this isn't right. I'm invested all this time and now it's not going to happen. And right at that time, the Army also rolled out OPMS 21, which allowed you to single track into a functional area. So I was one of the first cohorts that kind of said, okay, like I'll try this thing over here and become a single track F functional area 49 ORSA, mainly because I thought it was the best opportunity I had to make it to 20 years, but also because, right, again, know yourself, right? I thought maybe I had a competitive advantage, right? I was able to lead computer science and data analytics together better than other people. And so, kind of economics teaches you to go to comparative advantage. So I entered the Pentagon in 2000, and then did a number of eclectic assignments that got me I was in Iraq in 2004 as a interesting enough strategic planner, because turns out programming and a lot of the analytic skills are the same as planners. And so I kind of carved a niche for myself at the intersection of planning, resourcing, and authorities, and essentially kind of made that the basis of my career for the next 20 years.
Wow. Rewinding a little bit back to those second ACR and third ACR days as a young lieutenant, young captain, what were some of the skills that you learned then that helped prepare you for success?
So I think the first was teamwork. You hear a lot about competition amongst lieutenants when you're platoon leaders, and you hear a lot about that in company command. But I have to tell you, like, it was such a supportive environment of just peers helping peers move forward. And what the place taught me and what I learned in the cavalry is you're never going to have all the information that you need. You have to have the confidence to go out in front, gather up some of the information, and then make a call and do something, right? And then rely on the people who protect your flanks and your rear, right, to help you along the way, and have trust that people have you covered. And so when I went to the Pentagon, really it was, the Army makes these large resourcing decisions without actually knowing really what the future is going to entail. And so you've got to get out there, develop those relationships, and then have the confidence to understand who the other players are in your left and right. It could be another service, it could be another organization. Understand who they are, develop the relationships with them so that you trust them. So as you're making and advising people who make decisions, that everybody's moving in the same direction and has the same sight picture.
Absolutely. And building trust is something that has come up over and over and over again on this podcast. From your perspective, what are some of the best ways individuals can help build trust, both among their subordinates and their superiors?
So one of the things, as I got up in the ranks, as you become a general, you have the opportunity to speak to some of the younger officers and other people who are rising in the ranks. And I used to talk to them that DC and the military and military unit, it's inherently a human game. And while we talk about email and all these electronic devices, right, none of it is a substitute for looking somebody in the eye and talking to them in person. And that trust is built over time, and that in many respects, one of the challenges in our Army is that as we've gotten so busy, we've become very transactional. And that's one of the things the European militaries, when I worked in Afghanistan and Iraq, would say, hey, you Americans need to slow down a little bit, and we all need to kind of get to know each other first before we do some of these things. And so what I would say is that what I always used to tell everybody is The Congress is an important part, right? Because constitutionally, the Congress has the power to raise and maintain the military, not the chief of staff of the Army, not the secretary of the Army, not the president. The president employs the military, the Congress raises and maintains it. But so often, military leaders go over to the Congress and they start the conversation with, "Hello, my name is." And I said, if that's the first words out of your mouth, you've lost already because they don't know you. You have to go over to the hill over and over, and they need to know where you are. So the first words out of your mouth are, "Hey, how is your spouse? Hey, how's this going on in your district? Hey, the last time we talked about this. This is what we've done about it." So trust is earned repetitively over time and in person.
Absolutely, that's spot on. And I like what you're talking about there with Congress and knowing who you are as a senior military leader. And because that affects a lot of the resourcing of the entire Army is passed in the congressional budget every year, the National Defense Authorization Act. And as someone in planning, and you talked about the POM cycle, which this may be completely different for most of the folks listening to this podcast. The POM cycle is the 5-year cycle that the Army uses for organizational planning, for budgetary constraints, but yet we create all this strategic planning and it still relies on Congress to pass the budget. So what were some of the things from the higher level where you saw interaction work well together to tie that cycle in with the congressional budgetary cycle?
Yeah, so I think where it doesn't work well, let's start there, is when you go over with just the first year slice and you say, do this, and you don't actually have buy-in where you're going, right? So they just see things one slice at a time, and oftentimes it doesn't make sense. Where it works well is when you're developing your 5 or 10 year plan, right? 5 year for resourcing, maybe 10 year out. You start by going over there and you listen, right? Too often we go over there and we're on transmit mode and we're telling them, right? And so we think we're engaging them and they think we're just kind of droning on and trying to spew to them what we want them to do instead of acknowledging their role in the process. So where I've seen it work very, very well is when you go over and say, here's the problem we're looking at. What do you think? And then you listen to them and you write it down. And then you come back later and you go, hey, we talked to you. We talked to some other people. Here are like 3 or 4 options we're looking at. What do you think? And then you listen to them on the 3 or 4 options, right? And then you go back again and you go, hey, we've heard everybody. This is the option we're pursuing, and this is the implication for the next budget year. Too often we work day and night and we believe ourselves to be faithful servants of the people, and we come up with the single best solution in our minds ever. And then anyone who questions anything about it, we view ourselves as having, we put the shields up. And it's this solution must be defended at all costs. And that's when we get crosswise with our civilian masters who go, well, wait a minute, because they have not gone through that thought process. And a lot of times they've been through that with your predecessor and your predecessor's predecessor and your predecessor, because they've been there for many, many years. So I think that's the right. We talk about building trust in the 5-year process, right? It's listening, it's iterating with them as in a co-production mode, and acknowledging their superior role in the process, and then giving them your best military advice.
So as you're speaking there, it's running in my mind the process that you're explaining works equally as well for the military approaching Congress about a budget as it does an individual approaching their boss about a problem that they're facing or a challenge. That process of approaching the problem with questions and seeking outside opinions of where the other stakeholders see the situation is applicable in all kinds of different situations.
Yeah, so there's a great TED talk by Simon Sinek, right? And it's how to communicate. And he talks about why, how, and what, right? And why is at the center, right? And then you go to, like, why are we doing it? Then how are we doing it? And what are we doing? our military culture over time has transitioned to starting at the what. So we go into our boss and we say, well, I need 14 trucks and, 2 log packs. And it's like, well, and or you go to your left flank unit or your right flank unit, or you go to a NATO ally, or you go to the Afghans or the Iraqis with a list of things you want, right? Which is the what. And you never get out of there with it because there's no common understanding of the why, right? So he posits that, and again, as you talk to your boss, right, you need agreement on the why, right? Why are we doing this? And once you have agreement on the why, then there can be some discussion on the how. And if you agree on the why and the how, there's almost never a disagreement on the what.
Mm.
And so that serves you well as a lieutenant. In the same way, it serves you as a lieutenant general in the military. And in many respects, that's the basics of mission command. Leading by intent. It's making sure everybody understands the intent of the mission and why you're doing it. And if you spend more time on that, rather than I need you on Hill 304, then you're better off, and that will be successful in all parts of your life.
Sure, for sure. Was there an example or an opportunity throughout your career where you faced a difficult challenge like that, where the why and the how weren't aligning, and how did you overcome that?
Longer you stay in the military, and the more you rise in the chain of command, those are the only problems you're going to deal with, right? Because if things are going well, then you're not actually going to be addressing them. So as a lieutenant, you're executing and you're doing things, right? By the time you make it to the Pentagon, or even in Afghanistan, right, where I was in charge of the training and the equipment, the program side of the training and equipment for the Afghan military, uh, you know, every single thing, every day you wake up is that tension and friction, right? And that's just the price of admission is, right? Those are the only problems you get. And, one example is, Afghanistan. The president had just authorized the surge in Afghanistan. So the combat formations were coming in. The Congress had just approved taking the budget to train the Afghans from $3 billion to $11 billion. And the inspector general was coming in and was planning to go to the Secretary of Defense and said, don't let any of the money go over there. They're not ready for it. And I had just shown up, right? And it was true, right? Because like they had not surged the infrastructure of the organization that was going to spend that to do that. And so I had to spend a lot of time and effort, explaining to the inspector general, explaining to the combat commanders in the theater, explaining to the NATO allies and the Afghans, like why we were going to do things a certain way going forward. And really, it was tied to and trying to convince people that the Congress of the United States was writing this check. And if they felt that the money wasn't being spent wisely, they would stop writing the checks. And unlike in Iraq, where they did stop writing the checks, the Iraqis had oil money and they can continue to fund the military. Afghanistan had no money. And so I had to spend a lot of time kind of outlining and sketching why what we as a military did in Iraq, if we did it again in Afghanistan in the training and equip, the game was going to be over really fast because we had no alternative. And so I spent a lot of time on that, right? Rather than like, okay, what are we doing with this aircraft and this weapon? And do we have the helmets at this, right? All of that was important. And to the people on the ground, very important because they had schedules to keep. But to the long-term success of building the Afghan military, right? Keeping the trust with the Congress and the people who represented the Congress, in this case, the inspector generals, was paramount.
The things that is striking me in this part of the conversation is using data to make decisions. And as you're investigating or leading troops and figuring out, this $11 billion training budget, how are we going to utilize it effectively? How do you effectively, as a senior leader in a civilian organization or as a military commander, use data to help in that decision making process?
So Daniel Kahneman, who just passed away recently, is a Nobel Prize winning psychologist economist. And he wrote a book called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. And the premise of the book is like, and think about it in the military. We train to do things, right? You train to get out of your vehicle if it's hit by an IED, because when it's hit, you don't actually have time to think, right? So you repeat,
Right.
repeat, repeat. You train, you train, you train. It's like a pro athlete, right? You throw the ball, you shoot the ball thousands of times so that you don't have to think about it. The challenge is when you develop that reputation and expertise and it's in your mind and you don't have to think about it because everything is just connected. And then you go into a different area of expertise. So you're successful in the field as a battalion, brigade commander, right? And you're successful because you were a platoon leader, you were the supply officer, you were the XO, you were a company commander, you were the battalion 3, you were the brigade 3, you were the battalion commander. That muscle memory, you can look at a motor pool and go, okay, that needs to move, that needs to be fixed, that needs to be fixed. And then you develop this sense that, like, hey, my gut knows, I know what to do. But when you're transplanted into a different environment, then the ability to think fast is bad, right? Because those synapses haven't been connected, and you actually have to realize and be humble enough as a leader to go, my intuition is no longer good. So if your intuition is no longer good, you have only one other choice, which is to slow down and collect information. And data is just information. And so when you think about it, right, that's what that is. It's conditioning yourself as a leader to question your own judgment, to acknowledge that you're probably in the worst position. The higher up you go in the military, you are the least informed person to make generally a lot of the decisions. And so you rely on data and input from others, right? And then you kind of formulate the decision space from that. And that's a humbling experience for people who spent 20, 30 years, right? And been in repetitive assignments in organizations to come into an organization and not actually know what the right thing to do is, and then slowing down, listening, collecting data and information. Now, one can say in the battlefield, right, that a lot of the intuition that people thought they knew may be because of, right, we're at those inflection points now with drones and long range fires and electronic warfare. Maybe your intuition of what you honed in Afghanistan and Iraq is not sufficient, doesn't serve you well,
Mm.
right, if you're fighting in Ukraine or in Gaza or somewhere else. So then you have to collect data and information. The challenge, of course, now is it's very difficult to parse through all the noise to find the data that you need to make the decision to help you very quickly. So that's the challenge right now we have.
You're spot on. And one of the things that I'm thinking of as you're talking about that, there's a author by the name of Edward de Bono, and he wrote a book called Lateral Thinking. And it's a relatively old book, but in the book he's talking about the mind being like a bowl of jello. And if you pour hot water onto the bowl of jello in the same place over and over again, it starts to create a channel. And that's similar to how the mind works. And as information comes in, what fits it quickly floods into that channel, and you start to develop patterns of thinking, biases, tendencies, the sorts of things that happen from exposure to certain things. And when you move into a new area, that doesn't always serve you well. And figuring out exactly what you were talking about and how to shift your thinking, and not so much what you're thinking, but how you're thinking.
And understanding how the world around you and the environment around you has changed. And that gets back to what I'm reading, right? Which is like, well, okay, the method of communication has changed, right? So I need to figure out what that is. Hey, the people that we're interacting with who are younger than us, and it turns out that when you get my age, there are a lot more people younger than you than older than you, right? They think differently. Well, how do they think, right? And if you want to lead them, you got to lead them in a manner that they understand, not that you want to do, right? And then, computer computers do everything in interfaces, and right, understanding why government bureaucracies, right, why is it that in the military, right, that you can get an iPhone and turn it on and use it right out of the box, yet if we roll out a new radio, you've got to go to new equipment training for 30 days. Why is that? Right, and it's bad human factors engineering.
And also, kind of along that line, with the things that you're reading and the rapid changing environment that we're operating in, just as culture changes so quickly, how, as an organization, military or civilian, do you make a 5 or a 10-year long range plan or strategy, knowing that things are shifting so quickly?
So I think the key to that is you've got to acknowledge that you don't have all the information, and that some of the decisions you're making are going to be wrong, right? There's an old saying in the advertising world, half of my marketing is ineffective. The problem is I don't know which half. So you have to go in with a degree of humility, and then you have to put in place decision points. So if you say 5 years from now, I want to be at X, right? What you need to do is say, okay, this year, here's the information, here are the assumptions I've made. So one of the challenges planners do is you make assumptions. And then you quickly say, okay, now I can have a plan, right? Because a plan allows you to make assumptions. But we forget that they teach you in Leavenworth, right? An assumption is something so critical. If it's wrong, the plan is wrong. But then we never go and monitor the assumption. We don't put sensors on it. So we assume away the hard part of the problem, and then we lock in a solution. Instead, what you need to do is put in sensors and data collection efforts to let you know when the assumption is not failed, right, but is failing, right? Because when it's failing is when you need to go in and start adjusting your plan. And so we don't do that. What we generally do is say, okay, like we decided we're going on this path, and now we're just going to go down that path. And so that's the way the 5-year and 10-year plans work best, is when you stress test and you monitor and you do it, and then when the assumptions change, you come up with a new plan.
Right. And what you're saying is when an organization creates a plan and says, this is the plan, this is the answer, you hone in on one particular possible outcome, when the real trick should be to hone in and say, this is the problem. We're going to continue to monitor this problem as we evolve through time, and the right answer may change. The correct path to get there may change as we progress through time. Coming from a healthcare background, we have algorithms for all sorts of things. Someone's coding in the emergency department. You have an algorithm. Okay, we're going to first shock them, then we're going to give them this med. Did that work? Yes or no? Then we're going to move down that decision tree. And I think you're spot on that a lot of organizations' decision trees have no branches. They go straight and say, this is where we're going. But would be better served to have decision points and sensors along the way to say, yes, this is the main way we want to go, but if X, Y, or Z happens, we already have plans in place to shift left or right.
Yeah, and it's risk management, right? And it may be, okay, I think we're going in this way, but I'm going to keep this other option alive for 2 iterations of whatever the time frame is, right? Until I know. So for as much as we talk about risk in the military, we do a very bad job of quantifying it, and then we do an even worse job of mitigating it. What we generally do is transfer it and forget about it. So right, because we say, well, I've reduced risk. Well, no, it's nearly impossible to reduce risk. What you want to do is we've spread the risk out, right, so that it doesn't reside in one place. If you eliminate risk in your area, all you've done is increased it somewhere else. And so we get myopic and say, well, my plan is good. And you're like, well, okay, but all we did was, one example, well, we're gonna fund our weapons procurement, and we're gonna reduce facilities maintenance. So we've reduced our risk in war. Well, have you, or have you now let your facilities degrade that nobody wants to join the military, and now you don't actually have any soldiers, right? So you've concentrated the risk.
Right.
Really, when you look in the financial sector, the whole point of managing risk is to spread risk out, and that we don't do a good job at.
So one of the things that you're bringing up here and talking about financial management and spreading risk out, a large portion of the viewers of my podcast are both military and civilian business people in leadership and organizations or starting their own firms. So, what are some keys from a financial perspective of junior and mid level leaders managing financial risk in an organization?
So they have to understand the financial risk in their organization, right? So if you're in the civilian sector, you need to understand and be able to talk about a balance sheet and what's in a balance sheet and a profit and loss statement and an income statement and taxes and understanding the effects of, and whether you're in a private company that's a startup going from series A to B to C, right? And what the investors are looking for versus a public company and then going from quarterly earnings call to quarterly earnings call or even right financial reporting to the SEC. And so actions that you take right could have traumatic ramifications for the public sector markets, depending upon what you're doing and what sector you're in. And so when people go, well, that's not my job to worry about the money or the resources, right? Right. It's like, well,
Right.
actually it is, right? And you have to be very conversant on it and understand it because otherwise you can't understand the decisions you're making, the implications to the financial health of the organization you're in. Now, in the military, we don't have income statements and balance sheets per se, but we do have spending plans and we do have resources. And in many respects, the resources, and when you think about the war fighting,
Mm-hmm.
right, we used to count boots on the ground, right? That became a quasi financial metric type that you then had to balance against. So
Right.
if you don't understand all of the financing, right, and the financial metrics that you are being tracked, then you can't actually mitigate or understand or manage risk.
Absolutely. And one of the stories that brought up in my mind was I was at one point the operations manager for the Department of Neurology at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. It's the Department of Defense's largest neurology center. And one year we were getting close to the end of the year and we got a little bump of extra money. And one of the things, even though we had a budget for this clinic, the struggle was buying printer ink. And so we got a little bump of extra money, and I buy printer ink for all of our printers to the tune of $5,000 or $6,000 worth, which was a significant amount. And turns out that someone in the IT department in another silo over also had a bump of money at the end of the year, and they decided to buy us all new printers. So now I had this stockpile of ink for printers that we didn't have anymore. And that was one of those moments that I learned a lot from.
Kind of another lesson of leadership, which is transparency, right? And I've become an adherent to radical transparency, right? The higher up you go, the more transparent everything needs to be for precisely the reason you just stated. And it's hard to figure out like who needs to know. Like if you try to figure that out for every decision, you're probably going to get it wrong. And so you got to
Right.
figure out like how do you transmit what you're doing so that everybody can receive it and then decide on their own whether it's relevant or not to them. A lot of time, right, everybody likes to keep all that information to themselves. But instead, you really got to be transparent in your decision making and resourcing.
Absolutely. And in that situation, it was definitely a risk, but in an organization that's smaller than where I was at, that could be a detrimental mistake. And you're talking about printer ink, right? And that's something that's pretty laissez-faire in most places, if you will, is buying ink for a printer and you don't think about it. And just at that level, the communication between different or parts of an organization, between different silos, and breaking that down becomes super imperative. So throughout your career, what are some of the ways at a big operational level of looking at big army. How do you break those barriers down when it comes to resourcing?
So, as the director of program analysis and evaluation, right, my job was to help the Army put together that 5-year program every year. And one of the ways, and it's a complicated program, right? There are thousands, tens of thousands of data elements that go into it. Sometimes, right, people who do that, like they save up all the decisions and then show up to the leaders and go, okay, here are all the decisions. One of the things that I decided to do early was every week I was going to send out an update. And it wasn't necessarily a short update because there were a lot of things in it, but any item in it was going to be boiled down and shrunk to like, one or two lines, not even one or two sentences, like bullets.
Hmm.
And I would just go through every week those things that came up and were bubbling around. And I would use it to signal future decisions. I would use it to signal decisions that were about to be made. I would make sure that, because at that level, time is an important aspect. You can't say, well, in 2 days we're doing, because the bureaucracy doesn't move that fast. So it'd be like, okay, in two
Right.
months, these are the decisions we're going to make. And I would just every week, right, just keep updating that. And what would happen is after a while, right, people started recognizing the issues and they could see the pattern in the timelines of decisions. And as they rotated in, sometimes they'd be in one job and then they'd go to another, right? Because people rotate every year or two or three, right? They'd be able to see that decision making from, with different from a different seat, but it was that kind of repetitiveness and making sure that I knew how to boil the information down for the way senior leaders could consume it in manageable bites and just keep transmitting over and I always figured like if it's too long and they don't want to read it, they can hit delete, right? But I was going to put it out there for everybody. Now, again, like so think about what I said that right, I'm reading a book about brevity, right? So
Right.
there those emails had like they were chock full of information, but they were in bite-sized chunks, and they were signposted in a way that you could scan the left column and see if any of the topics interested you, and if not, you could be through it in 30 seconds. And if you wanted to read every word, right, well, it's going to take a while, right? But they were all in small, bulletized, well signed, no paragraphs, bullets, and they were also constructed in the same manner week after week so that you could train yourself. Okay, this is kind of how it's going to come and how I can communicate and how I can consume that.
Wow, that's a great technique to have clear, transparent communication across a large organization is consistent, bite-sized, easy to digest information. It could be a lot of information, but easy to digest in the same way over and over again, repetitive exposure.
What you're doing is training your readers to consume the information, right? One of the things people do that's counterproductive is if you change how you organize, or because then the readers got to spend all their time figuring out like how the information is organized. So that becomes very important. You know where all the information is each time you read it.
Absolutely. Yeah, consistency in that method. Changing gears just a little bit, tell us a little bit about where you are now and what your career has looked like post Army.
So, I've been doing a bunch of things. So, immediately the Army, I worked for a cybersecurity startup for a little bit, for about 3 years. And that was a wonderful experience in controlled chaos. For anyone who's worked in any type of startup, you're constantly, most people don't realize, but in this country, startups are, you hear all the big numbers, but you're really only funded like 3 or 4 months at a time. The investors give you money in these bite-sized chunks. And they do that because it's risk management. Like if you're not performing, then they move on to something else, right? So understanding and then managing in that tight decision cycle was a remarkable experience. During that time, I also started working for the American Enterprise Institute, really writing about and thinking about the defense budgeting process where I'd spent a lot of time and trying to help people understand defense resourcing. I've been doing that for about 4+ years. I also sit on a board or two. I work at a college, and so all of that kind of comes together into a kind of a grab bag of things that keep me occupied right now.
So as we close out here, what would be your top two or three things that you were able to take from your military career that set you up for success after your service?
So I think that the first thing is to know that leaders shoulder risk. So I tell the story. I came out of Afghanistan and went to White Sands Missile Range. And so I got there as as a reformed armored cavalryman ORSA, and they said, "Well, but you were an air defense officer." Nope. And they're like, "Well, you did contracting." Nope. Well, you did space stuff. Nope. And they were like, "Well, what expertise do you have?" Well, I'd been there for like 2 or 3 weeks, and we routinely put rockets into space. So we would send the rocket up, it would rotate the Earth would spin, but then we also had to bring the rocket and the payload back to the range, which is very difficult if you think about it. And the range is big, but it's not that big. And so I asked a question. They're in there, and in order to launch, I had to sign the paperwork. And so I asked a question like, well, okay, like what happens if like the rocket comes back and it lands like somewhere not on the range? And the range guys thought for a few minutes and they said, well, okay, we wait 2 weeks, the Army sends us a new CG commanding officer, and we start launching again. So I was there to bear the risk. It was like, okay, like I understand that, I can do that. And so the same thing in the civilian world, a lot of things are changing fast. And again, going back to my armored cavalry days, you're only going to have a fraction of the information. You've got to put it together, these bits and pieces, and then you got to make a decision, and you've got to kind of then monitor it, And I think that's the skill set that I came out of the military with more than anything else. That has kind of enabled me to do what I'm doing today in the civilian sector.
Absolutely. Knowing that and being able to assume risk, what is your advice to leaders that are put in a situation to assume risk that they don't have all the information on?
So I think, the advice is you really got to understand, the environment you're in. You have to decide, do you have the innate information and requisite knowledge to make that decision and assume that risk? Or do you have to rely on others to give you that so that you can then make the decision to assume the risk? And I think that's important. And then the question is, if you don't have it and you need it from others, you really have to develop the skill set of being able to assess other people. So that was the thing at White Sands. Everybody there was an expert in everything. And I had to sort through. It's like, well, okay, based upon how they're talking, are they nervous? Are they normally nervous? Is how they're communicating telling me something? Should I be worried? Shouldn't I be worried? And then being able to really understand who's telling you what and where those sources of information are enables you to then kind of assume the risk yourself. So that's really hard and something that you have to learn to do. Again, because the more senior you become, you are the least knowledgeable person to make the decision to assume risk. But with the job comes the responsibility to do just that. So then the question is, how do you surround yourself with the people and understand the people who can help you do that?
Well, sir, I think that brings everything full circle. We started talking about getting agreement on the why and the how, and end here with surrounding yourself with the who to help you decipher the information to assume the risk to make a decision. Thanks so much for joining me today. I appreciate your time and look forward to sharing this podcast with the world.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Did you like what you heard on today's podcast? If so, do me a quick favor and hit the like and subscribe button. That way you'll stay updated on all the new content that I publish. Also, visit me on social media, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube, And tell me what you want to hear more about. I love to hear your comments. That way I can continue to produce content that you love and enjoy. You can also check out my website, henrybeeman.com.